And that's why I like your book, is that I feel like you give us a holistic vision of how Christianity plays out to create a better humanity, which I think, and again I go back to New Begin and even Wright, where the church is to be a sign and symbol of what a redeemed humanity looks like, and a sign to the world and to the powers
Mhm.
of the reality of who God is, and rather than just a propositional truth to get you into heaven.
Well, and I think there's a need to become comfortable with um, a certain degree of ambiguity and incompleteness in this life. Like one of the topics kind of along the edges of our conversation the last few minutes is licit political resistance. Um, One of the things that's interesting in the Reformation tradition is if you read like Calvin and Calvin talking about the authority that the state has, Calvin doesn't seem to have any room whatsoever for any kind of resistance of political authority. Like, you submit to the state. If the state tells you to do something that goes against God's law, you don't obey. And when the state arrests you, you submit to that judgment. Like, he's pretty hard line on that. What ends up happening, though, is 8 years after Calvin dies, there's the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris, in France, which is basically this. They got all of, like, think Red Wedding, but wars of religion, Catholics killing Calvinists. And that's what Bartholomew's Day is. It's this meant to be this meeting, kind of for a meeting between the Calvinists and Catholics to talk about the governance of France, because France actually had a huge Calvinist population at the time, and then they just slaughtered all of them. That is when a lot of Protestants began thinking more seriously about just resistance of tyranny, because of Bartholomew's Day. And so I think one of the lessons of that story is that if we are glib about persecution, we kind of invoke that blood of the martyrs quote in a lazy, thoughtless way. That's actually not the best thing to do, because there's many examples throughout church history of regional churches collapsing due to persecution.
Mhm.
Um, and so we shouldn't be glib about that. And I think a lot of times there's a very kind of comfortable American kind of suburban middle class mentality about this that says, oh, well, the blood of the martyrs is the seat of the church. It'll be fine. That's true in some sense, but it's also true that regional churches die throughout church history. Philip Jenkins has written lots
Oh
of good.
yeah.
Um,
We actually talked about that when he came on the show. That was one of the things that we focused on.
yep. So yeah, we shouldn't be glib about that, and yet we also, I think, should be able to recognize that our moral horizons are broader than the world's, and so there are worse things than political defeat or martyrdom. Um, and if you're operating within a kind of imminent frame, there really isn't. But if you're a Christian, you don't live in an imminent frame. You live with the assumption that we are eternal beings. And um, I mean, I love the kind of mental experiments Lewis does, particularly in Great Divorce, where he's kind of asking, like, okay, if we're eternal beings, the virtues that we cultivate in this life with the aid of Christ that continues, like, we continue in some sense to grow toward God even in the eschaton. On the other hand, the vices and hatreds and evils that we kind of cultivate and nurture in our own hearts in this life, if we don't repent, there's some reason to think like those just continue to consume us forever. And so there's these images Lewis has of people in hell. Hell's like this crack in the sidewalk in heaven, because as people become more and more lost in their sin, they're unmade in some sense, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller. And the genius of it is you can always get smaller, and so they just also grow further and further and further away from each other. So there's a line in there about how one of the people that Lewis's character talks to remembers once seeing Napoleon, but now he's so small it's impossible to see him, or something like that. It's kind of amusing. Um, Very, very British humor, it feels like, to pick on Napoleon in particular. And But I think there's something to that. And so the warning for Christians, I think, is to say, like, if you allow anger and mistrust and hatred and these other vices to take up a place in your heart, and you don't repent of those things, but you actually see them as being somehow necessary for your politics, even necessary for the like spread of the church in some perverse way. Um, I, I think we can say if you take those things in and you don't repent, there's reason to wonder, do you know God? And if you don't know God and you take those things into your heart and you exist on into eternity, I mean, think about a bad habit that somebody has. Let me put it this way. Like I remember my brother-in-law used to be a pastor and he was an RUF guy first, PCA campus ministry, and then he was a church pastor at a church he planted. And I remember talking to him a few years into his parish ministry, and he made the comment to me. He said, "You know, when I did RUF, I used to think that pastors in normal churches deal with totally different issues than I do. And what I know now is that it's all the same issues. It's just they've had time to kind of curdle, as it were, for the adults in church." So he's like, you know, when I did RUF and I was meeting with a young guy who was struggling with sexual sin, the young guy had a porn problem and I needed to help him deal with it. And it might just be a matter of like, you should just cancel your home internet. And if you need internet to do work for school, go to a coffee shop or really just come to my house and use ours, but don't have internet at home. And that's the way you deal with it. But now you're a pastor in a parish church and you're dealing with a guy in his 40s who had an affair. That's a lot harder to untangle because now his wife is implicated, his kids are implicated, there's financial things, and there's also just an enormous amount of pain that is created by that. It's the same sin, but it's a different thing than the 20 something kid looking at porn in his dorm room. I think you can stretch that same kind of thought process out into eternity when we're dealing with sin and people who die apart from knowing God. And so there's a warning here. Like there is, and this is just basic stuff Jesus talks about in the Gospels. Like there are worse things than losing an eye or losing a hand. Like that's a pretty plain application of what Jesus says in the Gospels. And so I think one of the warnings for us is on the one hand, like, yes, it's perfectly licit to participate in politics and seek to see good laws passed and good, even good laws as understood by Christian moral teachings. Um, and yet there is a great spiritual danger in all of this. That you would, I'm trying to remember if it's what the biblical text is, but the idea of taking fire into your bosom and not being burned.
Mm.
Um, I think that is where a lot of people are now because we've allowed our horizons to become smaller than they are. And so we struggle to think of something worse than 4 more years of Democrat presidency. And it's like I can think of worse things for more years
Mm-hmm.
of the Democratic presidency. For much of Christian history, Christians have dealt with far worse political realities than American Democrats in the 21st century. Um, and God has seen them through it, and they are now with him. And I would desire that for us as well, rather than us becoming lost in um, Machiavellian political intrigue.
You're the second person to mention Machiavellian Christianity in the last week, just so you know. That's just kind of funny that you mentioned
Probably a
that.
reason.